Recognition. So you've read that from the paper already. Good. Okay. So those are the general ideas that we want you to remember. Now, in terms of the recall tasks, why they're worse, they tend to also, just as an aside, what are some of the errors that you think are more common as speech? When I give you a word list, and later on I ask you to do free recalls, what are some of the patterns or problems that may show up more often?
The order of the words.
Okay, well, the order of the words, yeah, that's a possibility. I haven't really looked into that, though. That's an interesting question. Because usually when we ask them to free recall, we allow them to do it in any order, knowing that it could be pretty hard for them to remember the order as well. What else may show up as a problem of difficulty?
Well, they make it part of the word, perhaps.
Okay, yes?
The question is about?
The question is about what types of difficulties may show up when they do a free recall task.
Is it older adults?
Or as we age.
Me?
You and, yeah. Go first.
They might bring up something that's related to it. So if you tell them to remember the words like apple, banana, and pineapple, fruit might be easier. So they might bring that up because it's more of like a blanket one for 5 words they can remember.
So they may come up with the category word instead of the other words.
Yeah.
It does show up sometimes as well. So yes, so they may give you irrelevant or answers, intrusion errors, things that don't actually appear on the original list. What are some of the other difficulties they may have?
The auditory sense may be deficient, so they may not have actually heard the word properly.
So that's, again, goes back to the problem with encoding, thank you. So if they don't encode the word properly, they probably would also have some other types of intrusion errors. Now, the other types of errors that may happen occur would be omission error, of course, meaning they tend to remember fewer words. They omit some of the words. And also repetition errors, meaning a lot of times they would repeat a word even though they have already told you that word. These things seem to be more apparent as we age. And the age difference can be fairly large. And sometimes even if you try to give them cues or if you try to slow down the presentation, it does not always help. It helps to some degree, but it doesn't always reliably help. You may want to think about why that is the case. Now, recognition, on the other hand, like I said, the age difference is much smaller. But if you ask them, have you seen this word before? Was this word on the list? It seems like they're also more likely to say yes to items that were not previously on the list. So that's one problem. For example, bless you. If you presented the word squirrels, later on they may say chipmunks, even though chipmunks was never on the list. So what this example brings up is the fact that, like one of you said earlier, sometimes people seem to be, especially as we age, we seem to be thinking about the conceptual meaning, the broad categories, rather than the smaller, finer detail. So maybe that's the way it brings to mind how our mind works, sometimes. And that seems to be more apparent as we age as well. So, summary so far, we know much more about encoding and retrieval than storage. We know there are age differences, more so in encoding and retrieval than storage. And in terms of retrieval, we know that there are way more age differences in recall than recognition. So those are the key concepts and the main ideas that hopefully you'll remember by the end of today's lecture. Okay? Is that clear? Anything else to add to the model, or ideas and concepts? Okay. Yes?
What was that third area you referred to? It was intrusions, omissions, and
Intrusion, omission, and repetition. Those are some different kinds of memory or errors that may come up. Let's say you give them a word.
Is intrusion the one when you were saying, like, you might come up with a category, like you can't remember banana,
Or-
so you say fruit?
Yeah, or just anything that did not belong to the previous list.
Okay.
Anything that that is not supposed to be an answer.
Okay.
Example of intrusion. So it's not so much for the purpose of understanding the basic model, but these terms may come up in the future if you read other articles related to recall, recognition, and so on. So, shall we move on? Okay. Now this is a much more complicated model. And once again, like I said earlier today, it's based on an integration of different memory models. So it might be a little different from what you have seen before. Sensory input is what I've mentioned earlier today. A lot of things in this room can be considered as a type of sensory input. Could be visual, like what you see on the screen. Could be auditory, what I'm saying right now. It could also be the noise from the back of the room and from the AC. So probably you're filtering that out. It could also be touch, like touching your keyboard, typing, writing. Those are different types of sensory input. And the idea when it comes to information processing, really, even with computers, is that we have a limited capacity to process information. We can't process everything. So even though when we get those sensory input, they tend to go into the sensory memory, it doesn't stay for a very long time. Some of it, through automatic processing, may eventually get to the long-term memory. But a lot of it would rely on our active manipulation and processing in the working memory part of the model in order to get consolidated so that it would get into the long-term memory. So what is sensory memory? It's just one way to look at a very temporary storage that we have. Is the retention, like the idea at least, is that it retains the exact copy of what you see or hear or feel. So it's like a buffer, temporary storage. And so your sensory receptors would detect the input. And then the sensory registers, they have a huge capacity to hold these things. But they're not processed. They're not processed. So I'm actually thinking of the example being given earlier today about the actor image you see. It sounds to me that it would be one example of, just something completely being mapped on. It's not really going through any type of conscious processing. It's beyond, let's put it that way. Sensory memory is relatively beyond conscious control. Things just get through it. And then either they're stored or they're gone. Okay? So the two types that people have studied the most would be visual versus auditory. But there are different kinds. Now, once the information gets passed down to short-term memory, and usually that would involve some level of attention, selective attention, trying to have some attentional control, paying attention. After that, it would get filtered, and then it get passed down to other parts of the memory model. Make sense so far? Now, a few of you brought up the term short-term memory earlier today. It is one way to look at memory when we categorize it into short versus long-term. And I think it's a key concept. It's not here. But depending on your focus, on different models for memory, sometimes people would, it seems like a lot of times people look at short-term memory and working memory as interchangeable. But if you go back to